The night was heavy, with the sound of sirens and crackling flames. Malik, a 14-year-old homeless boy who had grown accustomed to navigating the gritty streets of the city, noticed the flickering glow of fire through the alleyway. He was used to seeing chaos, gunshots, broken windows, people rushing in all directions. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the fire wasn't just some neighborhood blaze. It was big, bigger than anything he had seen in his life. He was scavenging near the rundown apartments, looking for anything he could use to survive. But as he approached the source of the commotion, he heard something faint, a cry that was being drowned out by the crackle of the flames. Without a second thought, Malik's feet moved faster. He wasn't sure who or what was inside, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing. As he reached the mansion, smoke poured from the windows. Flames devoured the structure in an almost theatrical frenzy, but Malik's eyes locked onto a window on the second floor. He saw a figure, barely visible, trapped behind the thick smoke. The cry came again, a faint, desperate sound that no one else seemed to notice. Instinctively, Malik sprinted forward, dodging past the barricades of fire trucks and shouting bystanders. He leapt over the fallen garden gate, ignoring the searing heat. He didn't know who she was, but he knew someone needed him. He found her unconscious, barely breathing, wedged against a collapsed piece of furniture in a smoke-filled room. Malik's heart raced. This wasn't his world, but this was his moment. Without hesitation, he grabbed the woman, Olivia, and hoisted her over his shoulder. Every second was a risk. The house was crumbling around him. The air was thick with smoke, and flames curled dangerously close, but Malik pressed on. He dodged burning beams and shattered glass, moving with a determination he hadn't known he possessed. Finally, with a burst of adrenaline, Malik burst through the front door, just as part of the roof collapsed behind him. He barely managed to carry Olivia away from the fire before it exploded with a thunderous roar, sending debris flying into the air. The crowd that had gathered stood in shock, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. But Malik didn't wait for their applause. He slipped away, unnoticed by most, vanishing into the night with Olivia cradled in his arms. The next morning, Malik awoke in an abandoned building, Olivia's head resting lightly on his lap. He had carried her all the way to a nearby shelter, his legs sore and body bruised, but he had gotten her to safety. The fire was out, but the adrenaline from the night before was still coursing through him. Malik looked at Olivia, now stirring softly. Her designer clothes were singed and torn, but she was alive. He didn't know what had happened to the rest of her family or what had caused the fire, but one thing was clear. He had saved her life. As Olivia regained consciousness, she looked at Malik with confusion. She tried to sit up but winced in pain. Where am I?" she murmured. Malik glanced around, unsure of how to explain. "You're safe," he said simply. I saved you from the fire." Olivia's eyes slowly cleared, and she looked around at the unfamiliar, dingy surroundings. She wasn't used to places like this. She wasn't used to anything like Malik. "Who are you?" she asked, still groggy. "I'm Malik," he answered, his voice soft, but his heart pounding in his chest. I live around here." She stared at him, a mix of gratitude and confusion in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "But why would you risk your life for me?" Malik shrugged. "I don't know. I just couldn't leave you there." Hours later, after Olivia had regained some strength, Malik made sure she was as comfortable as possible. She was still in shock, but she insisted that she needed to leave, that someone would be looking for her. Malik didn't argue. He helped her stand up and guided her out of the building, walking quietly through the streets. Just as they reached the edge of the neighborhood, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. A man, wearing a sharp suit and looking frantic, jumped out. "Olivia!" he called, rushing over. "Oh, my God, you're safe! Thank God you're safe!" Olivia looked up at the man, her face softening with recognition. "John, I was trapped in the fire," she said, her voice shaking. "Thank you," John said to Malik, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know what we would have done without you." But as John spoke, Olivia seemed to notice something. She looked at Malik, then back at John, her confusion deepening. "Who is he?" she asked. John turned to Malik, studying him for a moment. He looked different from the usual crowd Olivia associated with, but there was something in his eyes, something real. "Who are you?" John asked Malik, his tone softer now. "I'm just a guy," Malik answered, trying to downplay the situation. But John wasn't buying it. "Number you saved Olivia's life. You're not just anyone." The next day, John, who turned out to be Olivia's fiancé, showed up at the place where Malik had been staying. He arrived with a big surprise: property papers. "You saved my fiancé's life," John said, "and I want to repay you. I want to give you a home, and I want to make sure you have a future." Malik couldn't believe it. A home? For him? A place to call his own? John handed him the papers, a symbol of an opportunity Malik never imagined possible. "You deserve this," John continued. "We're giving you everything: an education, a home. We'll help you get a job. We'll make sure you're never without again." Malik stood there, stunned, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For the first time in his life, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was worth more than he ever thought. The morning light filtered in through the cracks in the walls of the makeshift shelter. The sounds of the city outside seemed distant, muffled by the heavy air that filled the room. Olivia slowly stirred from her sleep, her head throbbing, memories of the fire flashing in and out of her mind. She sat up groggily, trying to process the events, but everything felt surreal. Everything except the strange, unfamiliar surroundings. As she glanced around, confusion clouded her expression. Where was she? How did she get here? "Hey, you okay?" Malik's voice broke through her haze, and she turned to find him sitting at the edge of the room, his eyes filled with concern. I don't remember how I got here. The fire," she trailed off, her voice trembling. Malik stepped forward, his hands raised in reassurance. "You were trapped in that fire. I pulled you out, got you out of there before it all went up in flames." Olivia's brow furrowed as the details slowly came back to her. She remembered the flames, the smoke, the heat, but she didn't remember being rescued. "You saved me?" she asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Yeah, I carried you out of the building and brought you here, away from the fire." Her confusion turned into something softer, something akin to gratitude, but she didn't have the chance to voice it. She was still trying to make sense of it all, when the distant sound of sirens began to grow louder. Malik's eyes widened slightly, his body tensing. "That's not good," he muttered under his breath, standing up quickly. Olivia's heart raced. "What's happening?" Before Malik could answer, there was a loud knock at the door. "Open up! Police!" The voice came from behind the door, commanding and insistent. Olivia froze, fear flooding her chest. "What's going on? Why are they here?" Malik's hand reached for the door, but he hesitated. He turned back to Olivia with a look of uncertainty in his eyes. "Stay calm. I'll figure this out." He opened the door just a crack, and before he could react, A dozen officers flooded into the room, pushing him aside roughly. "Hands on the wall! Now!" one of the officers shouted, forcing Malik's hands against the cold brick. Olivia's heart pounded. "Wait! Stop! He didn't do anything. He saved me." But the officers ignored her pleas. They shackled Malik's wrists, the sound of the cuffs snapping shut echoing in the small room. "You're under arrest for the abduction of Olivia Winters," the officer said, his voice cold and unyielding. "No, you don't understand." Olivia rushed forward, but they stepped in her way, blocking her path. "He saved me. He didn't kidnap me. He's the one who pulled me out of the fire." The officers exchanged skeptical looks, clearly unconvinced. "Ma'am, the footage shows him carrying you out of the building," one officer stated, his tone dismissive. "We have evidence of the abduction." "That's not true," Olivia shouted. "He's the one who saved my life." The officers continued to ignore her, focusing on restraining Malik. He stood silently, his face calm, but his body tense with the weight of the situation. The confusion and panic in Olivia's eyes only deepened as she watched them haul him out of the shelter. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Just calm down, ma'am. He'll be processed, and you'll have a chance to explain your side," the officer replied, his voice far from compassionate. As Malik was shoved toward the door, he caught Olivia's gaze. For a brief moment their eyes locked, and he gave her a small, resigned nod. "I'll be okay," he said quietly, though it was clear he wasn't entirely sure himself. But Olivia wasn't so sure. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let the one person who had shown her compassion be thrown away by a system that was too quick to judge. "Please, you have to listen to me," she shouted, but the door slammed shut behind the officers, and Malik was gone. For a moment, Olivia stood frozen in the room, the confusion and anger flooding through her. She had trusted him, and now he was being arrested as a criminal for doing the right thing. The injustice of it all hit her like a wave, but she was determined not to let him fall through the cracks. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed the number she never thought she'd need to call, her lawyer. She was going to make sure Malik was freed, and the truth would come out. The sirens outside seemed to grow louder, and Olivia knew that her battle was just beginning. She couldn't rest until Malik's name was cleared, and the truth about what had really happened came to light. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Spectators whispered in hushed voices as Malik sat in the defendant's chair, his eyes locked on the floor. His hands were bound, and despite his calm exterior, the anxiety was palpable. He had been branded a criminal, accused of kidnapping Olivia Winters, a crime he hadn't committed. The charges were ridiculous, yet no one had believed him. He had tried to explain himself, but no one had listened. Now, here he was, in a courtroom, surrounded by people who thought the worst of him. The prosecutor, a stern man in a well-tailored suit, was relentless. He painted Malik as a dangerous figure, someone who had taken advantage of Olivia's vulnerable state. Every word that came from his mouth only deepened the hole that Malik felt himself sinking into. "This young man," the prosecutor said, pointing at Malik, "has committed a heinous crime. He forcibly took Miss Winters from the scene of the fire, likely with the intention of extorting her for money. The evidence is clear. The surveillance footage shows him carrying her from the wreckage. And what do we see? No good deed, only criminal behavior." Malik flinched at the words. His mind raced back to the moment he'd pulled Olivia from that burning car. He hadn't done it for money or recognition. He had just acted. Yet here he was, fighting for his freedom in a system that didn't care about the truth. "I didn't do this," Malik said quietly, his voice barely audible. I saved her life. She was dying in that car, and I couldn't leave her." But the courtroom only echoed back silence. The judge, an older man with a stern face, motioned for the prosecutor to continue. And then the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Olivia stepped into the room. She was wearing a formal outfit, her posture strong, but her face betraying the turmoil within. She had not yet spoken up in the trial, but now her presence seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room. Everyone turned to her, including Malik, who stared at her, feeling a sense of hope. Finally, someone would tell the truth. Olivia walked forward, past the row of attorneys and the jury, and stood beside the witness stand. She glanced at Malik briefly, her eyes softening. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I need to speak." The courtroom fell silent as Olivia began her testimony. She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts, and then she began to recount what had happened that night. "I was in that car, trapped and burning," she started, her voice unwavering. "I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die. And then this boy, Malik, he came from nowhere. He pulled me out of the wreckage without hesitation. He carried me out of the flames before the car exploded. He saved my life." A murmur of disbelief ran through the crowd. "The truth is," Olivia continued, locking eyes with the judge, "Malik is not a criminal. He's a hero. He didn't take me for ransom, and he didn't hurt me. He helped me when no one else did. He saw someone in danger and did what any decent person would do. He saved me." The prosecutor was left speechless. His previous accusations hung in the air, failing to hold any weight now. The courtroom was quiet for a long moment as everyone processed Olivia's words. "You have no idea what it's like to be judged based on the color of your skin," Olivia continued, her voice growing stronger. "I came into this courtroom thinking Malik was just another kid from the wrong side of town, and I thought I had all the answers. But now I know I was wrong. He is not the criminal here. I am." The room fell silent again as her words hung in the air, heavy with truth and realization. Malik's eyes filled with a mix of surprise and relief as he looked at Olivia, who was now speaking up for him in a way he had never expected. The judge, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. "Based on the testimony provided, I believe we have enough grounds to dismiss all charges against the defendant." His voice was firm, his gavel coming down with authority. "The accusations of kidnapping and extortion are unfounded. I hereby declare Malik Carter not guilty, and I urge everyone here to take note of the true heroism shown today." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers as Malik was freed from the shackles that had bound him. His heart raced as he stood, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like the world wasn't against him. He had done the right thing, and for once, he was being recognized for it. Olivia stepped forward, her eyes locked on Malik. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You saved my life, Malik, and I'll never forget that." Tears welled in Malik's eyes, his heart swelling with emotion. "I just did what anyone would have done." The judge nodded, his expression softened. "Sometimes that's all it takes, one act of courage to change everything." As the courtroom emptied and the buzz of conversation began to grow, Malik stood tall, no longer a boy facing false accusations, but a young man who had been proven right by the truth. In that moment, he knew he wasn't just a bystander in his own life anymore. He was the hero of his own story. Ethan stood in the doorway of the courtroom, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the proceedings. He had watched everything unfold, the shock, the disbelief, and finally, the truth coming to light. He had witnessed Olivia's heartfelt defense of Malik, and he could no longer deny the gravity of the situation. The look in Malik's eyes, filled with a mix of relief, pride, and exhaustion, had struck something deep within him. After a few tense moments, Ethan made his way to the front, his steps slow but purposeful. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as he approached Malik, who still stood near the defense table, his body tense from everything he had just endured. Ethan's eyes locked onto Malik's, and for a moment there was only silence. The court staff, the audience, and the reporters all waited for what would happen next. Malik, unsure of what to expect, stood still, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. What could a billionaire like Ethan possibly want with him? Then, without saying a word, Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a set of property papers. He handed them over to Malik with a steady hand, his voice firm yet filled with warmth. "I've been wrong," Ethan said, his voice resonating across the courtroom. "You saved someone I love. You did what was right, and no one should suffer for doing the right thing. I want to change that. This," he said, gesturing toward the papers, "is yours. A place to call home. A fresh start." Malik blinked in shock, his eyes flicking between Ethan and the property papers in his hands. A fresh start? A home? For him? His heart raced, and the words he had longed to hear seemed impossible to grasp. "No, I can't take this," Malik stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do it for anything. I just wanted to help her." "I know you did," Ethan said with a soft smile. "But you deserve this. You deserve more than just surviving. You deserve a chance to live." Tears welled up in Malik's eyes as he held the papers in his hands, his grip tight around the edges. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was being offered a chance to thrive, to be something more than the labels that had been placed on him. Olivia, standing behind Ethan, stepped forward, her voice filled with emotion. "Malik, I'll never be able to repay you for what you did. But I hope this is a start. You're family now, and you'll never be alone again." The courtroom, once filled with the tension of an unjust trial, now buzzed with an air of hope and admiration. Even the reporters who had so quickly sensationalized the case were silent, witnessing this profound moment of change. Malik took a step forward, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling a lump form in his throat. "You don't know what this means to me." Ethan smiled, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "You've already proven what kind of person you are. This is just the beginning." With a deep breath, Malik looked down at the property papers in his hand once more. This was it. His life was about to change. He wasn't just a boy from the streets anymore. He was someone who had made a difference, and now he had the opportunity to build something for himself. As the court session officially ended, Malik walked out of the courtroom, the papers still clutched in his hand. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of hope and possibility. A few days later, Malik stood in the doorway of his new home, a modest house, but a home nonetheless. He stepped inside, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked around. The walls, freshly painted, were bare, but to Malik, they were filled with potential. It was his new beginning, and he wasn't going to waste it. As he sat on the couch, the weight of everything that had happened finally hit him. He had come so far from that boy who had simply been trying to survive. He now had a future to build, and he would make the most of it. With a smile, he picked up his phone and called his mother, sharing the good news with her. He could hear her crying on the other end, but this time they were tears of joy. "I'll never be able to thank you enough," his mother said, her voice shaking. "You've changed our lives." "Yeah," Malik replied, his voice filled with determination. "And we're just getting started." Jaden's footsteps were slow but steady as he walked through the wet streets of the desolate neighborhood. The city was a maze of abandoned buildings and cracked pavement, the air thick with the smell of mildew and forgotten promises. The rain had started to pour heavily, but Jaden barely noticed. He had learned to ignore the discomforts of life long ago. His thin jacket did little to protect him from the cold, but he was used to it. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten much today. As usual, he had scavenged for food in the back alleys, hoping for something that might fill the emptiness inside him, even for just a little while. He wasn't picky. Half a sandwich left behind by someone too busy to finish it or a piece of fruit discarded in a trash can would be enough. It was the way things were for him, surviving, day by day, always one step ahead of hunger and despair. Jaden made his way past a row of crumbling buildings, each one more decrepit than the last. He had found shelter for the night in one of them, a storage room that no one seemed to care about anymore. The space was small, but it was dry, and for tonight that would have to be enough. But as he rounded the corner near an old, abandoned house, something caught his attention. It was faint at first, the sound barely audible over the rain and the wind. A cry, a baby's cry. Jaden froze, his heart suddenly racing. His eyes scanned the alley, searching for the source of the sound. The rain had soaked through his jacket, but he barely felt it. His mind raced. He was used to hearing the cries of children in the streets, but they were usually lost, abandoned by neglectful parents. He couldn't ignore this one. The cry was full of desperation, raw and heartbreaking. Someone needed help. Without thinking, Jaden rushed towards the alley, his footsteps splashing in the growing puddles. The sound led him to a dark corner, hidden from the main street. There, near the side of the old house, he found it. An infant, no more than a few months old, lying in a pile of discarded trash, wrapped in a dirty, torn blanket. The baby's face was red from crying, its tiny hands reaching out as if desperately searching for comfort. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anything like this before. He had heard stories of babies being abandoned, but to find one here in the wet, cold night, all alone, it felt like a punch to his gut. Without thinking, Jaden knelt beside the baby, his hands shaking, as he carefully lifted the child into his arms. The baby's cries subsided just slightly, as Jaden cradled it gently, trying to calm it with soft whispers. "Hey, it's okay," Jaden murmured, his voice full of tenderness. "You're safe now. I'll take care of you." He looked around, panic rising in his chest. He had no idea what to do. He had no parents, no shelter, and no resources to care for a baby. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The baby needed him, and he wasn't about to let it down. Jaden glanced back at the street, hoping to see someone, anyone who could help. But the streets were empty, save for the rain, the distant sounds of the city, and the occasional crack of thunder. He was alone, and so was the baby. Determination filled him. He couldn't just leave the baby here. He had to do something. But where could he go? Where could he find safety for both of them? His mind raced through his few options. His old storage room? It wasn't the safest place for a child. The streets, even more dangerous. Then, as if by instinct, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't just stand there. He had to get the baby somewhere safe, somewhere where it could be cared for. Jaden held the baby close to his chest, his heartbeat in sync with the infant's small, fragile breaths. His hands trembled as he stood up, but he moved forward with purpose. There was no turning back now. Jaden's heart raced as he approached the source of the faint cries, his eyes scanning the dimly lit alleyway. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, the kind of place that most people avoided. His fingers trembled, but it wasn't out of fear. It was out of uncertainty, an unfamiliar feeling welling up inside him. He had seen so many hardships in his young life, but nothing prepared him for what he was about to find. Turning a corner, Jaden's eyes fell on a broken-down building, the door hanging off its hinges like it hadn't been opened in years. As he stepped inside, the faint cries grew louder, urgent and desperate. In the corner of the room, hidden beneath a layer of dust and forgotten debris, lay a tiny form, a baby girl. Wrapped in a thin, frayed blanket, the child lay motionless on the splintered wooden floor. Her skin, pale and cold, made her look as though she had been abandoned for much too long. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. He quickly moved forward, kneeling beside the baby, his hands shaking as he gently reached for her. Her tiny, fragile body was stiff, the little chest barely rising as she struggled to breathe. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. He couldn't break down now. He had to think. His mind raced. He didn't know what to do. He was just a boy. He barely had enough for himself. His small shelter was cold, and he didn't even know how he'd feed her. But there was no choice. He couldn't just leave her here. Without another thought, Jaden carefully scooped the baby into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if his warmth could transfer to her. The chill from her body sent a shiver through him, but he held her tight, wrapping her in his own shirt to keep her warm. She was so small, so fragile. He had to do something, anything. His footsteps echoed as he moved swiftly through the abandoned building, the weight of the baby in his arms reminding him of the magnitude of what he was about to undertake. He could feel his own hunger gnawing at his stomach, but he couldn't think of that now. He had to get her to safety. He had to protect her. The walk back to his small shelter felt like a lifetime. With each step, he weighed the reality of the situation. He had no food, no supplies, no help. It was just him. But something deeper within him, something he didn't quite understand, pushed him forward. He wouldn't let this baby girl die alone. He would find a way to save her. When he finally reached his makeshift home, a small abandoned room that he had found refuge in, Jaden carefully laid the baby down on a corner of the floor. He rummaged through his few belongings, finding an old jacket and a torn blanket to create a warmer spot for her. He sat down beside her, his heart still pounding in his chest. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but for the first time in his life, Jaden felt a surge of purpose. There was no turning back. He had made a decision. The baby would survive. He would make sure of it. Jaden's heart pounded as he walked through the crowded streets, the baby cradled in his arms. Her tiny whimpers filled the silence between the honking cars and the murmurs of passing pedestrians. He glanced down at the little girl, her fragile body wrapped in his thin jacket. The weight of her dependence was overwhelming, but he couldn't let her down. With a determined step, Jaden headed toward the small corner store on the busy block, hoping for a miracle. The sign outside read "Local Groceries," a place he'd passed by countless times but never thought to enter. Today, it was his only hope. Inside, he moved quickly to the baby aisle, scanning the shelves for baby formula. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, but he pushed forward. He didn't care about the stares or the judgments anymore. He had to find something to feed her. The shopkeeper, a stern-faced man who looked barely interested in his customers, barely acknowledged Jaden as he picked up a tin of formula. "Excuse me, sir, how much for this?" Jaden asked, his voice shaky from both exhaustion and nerves. The shopkeeper looked up slowly, sizing him up. Jaden could tell he didn't think much of him, a young black boy, dressed in tattered clothes, holding a baby he had no business taking care of. He sighed heavily and shook his head. "That's $25, the man said flatly. "Do you have the money for it?" Jaden's stomach sank. He reached into his pockets, fingers brushing against the few coins he had. It wasn't enough, not even close. I don't have enough," Jaden mumbled, lowering his gaze. The shopkeeper didn't even look surprised. "Then you can't buy it," he said dismissively. "Maybe you should try begging somewhere else." Jaden felt the sting of those words, but he couldn't focus on that. He had to feed the baby. His mind raced with ideas, but none of them seemed good enough. He walked out of the store, feeling a sinking hopelessness. Outside, the cold air hit his face, sharp and unforgiving. Jaden looked down at the baby in his arms, her innocent eyes staring up at him. He couldn't let her down. He needed to find a way to help her. For hours, he wandered the streets, stopping anyone who looked like they might help. He approached businessmen, old women, even teenagers, anyone who might have a spare dollar or a kind heart. But time and time again, he was turned away. Some people ignored him, others looked at him with suspicion, and a few made snide comments about how he shouldn't be walking around with a baby like that. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, an elderly woman stopped in front of him. She had kind eyes, though her face was lined with age and hardship. Her clothes were modest, but there was a warmth to her presence that caught his attention. "What's the matter, son?" she asked, her voice gentle. She had seen him standing at the corner, holding the baby in his arms, looking helpless. I need to get formula for her," Jaden explained, voice tight with frustration. "But I don't have enough money. I've been trying all day." The woman studied him for a moment, and then her face softened. "You've been taking care of her, haven't you?" Jaden nodded, surprised at how someone could see through him so easily. "I'm trying. I just don't know how to get her the food she needs." She smiled and reached into her bag. "Come with me," she said, beckoning him toward a nearby store. They walked together in silence, and when they reached the small market, the woman went straight to the baby section, picking up a tin of formula. "Here," she said, pressing it into his hands. "This will help." Jaden couldn't believe it. He looked at the tin, then back at her. You really want me to have this?" She nodded. "I can't turn my back on someone who's trying their best. I've seen too many people walk away from others in need. You're doing the right thing. Now, you make sure she's taken care of." Overcome with gratitude, Jaden almost couldn't speak. He had been ignored, rejected, and looked down on all day, and here was this woman offering him a lifeline when he'd almost given up. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." The woman smiled again, patting his shoulder. "You'll be fine, son. Take care of her." As he left the store, holding the tin of formula tightly in his hands, a sense of hope filled his chest. He wasn't alone. There were good people out there, people who saw his heart, not just the outside world that judged him. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could face it. He wasn't giving up on this little girl, and for the first time, he felt like he had a shot at making things right for both of them. Over the next 2 days, Jaden did everything he could to care for the baby. He kept her warm, fed her, and made sure she was as comfortable as possible in the abandoned building. He kept watch over her while he scavenged for more food for himself. His heart swelled with a love he hadn't known he was capable of. Despite all his struggles, he had found purpose in caring for her, and in return, she had brought him something he didn't expect: hope. Jaden walked through the bustling streets, his heart heavier with each step. For days, he had taken care of the baby, kept her warm, and given her the love and comfort he himself had rarely known. He had grown attached, her innocent face becoming a source of solace in the grim world he lived in. But now, as he overheard the conversation between 2 bystanders about the wealthy couple's missing child, his stomach twisted into knots. "Their daughter's been gone for 3 days now," one of the men said, his voice tinged with worry. "It was a kidnapping during that robbery downtown. They're offering a huge reward." Jaden froze. He turned his head slightly, trying not to make it obvious that he was eavesdropping. His mind raced as the pieces clicked together: the baby, the robbery, the kidnapping. His heart pounded as he wondered if this was the same child, the one he'd been caring for. But what did that mean for him? He wasn't the child's father. He wasn't even supposed to have her. She was supposed to be with her real family, not with someone like him. He glanced down at the baby, who was sleeping peacefully in his arms, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside him. The weight of the choice pressed down on him. What if he returned her and they didn't believe him? What if the wealthy couple assumed he was the one who had kidnapped her? The thought of losing her, of being alone again, made him feel physically sick. This baby, this innocent soul, had become his little companion. It had felt like family. But he knew deep down that the right thing to do was to give her back to her real family. Tears welled up in his eyes as he stood there, the weight of the decision suffocating him. He could feel his grip tightening around her tiny body, his fingers trembling. He had never been so afraid of rejection, afraid of being left with nothing again. With one last look at the baby, he wiped away a tear and turned in the direction of the police station. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about making sure she had the life she deserved. A life he couldn't provide, no matter how much he wished he could. Jaden's feet felt heavy as he walked, the familiar streets of his neighborhood now feeling like a vast, cold expanse. His breath caught in his chest as he approached the police station, his mind replaying all the what-ifs over and over. But there was no turning back now. As he entered the station, the officers behind the counter looked up, noticing the young boy with a baby in his arms. Their faces shifted from routine indifference to surprise as Jaden slowly walked toward them. He approached the desk, his heart in his throat, and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I have to give her back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's the baby from the news. I don't want to, but I know it's the right thing." The officers exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the boy standing before them. Jaden carefully handed the baby over to one of the officers, his hands shaking. I just wanted her to have a chance," he added quietly, almost to himself. One officer stepped forward, his expression softening. "You did the right thing, kid," he said gently, reassuring him that he wasn't in trouble. But Jaden didn't hear it. All he could hear was the sound of his own heart breaking as he walked away, knowing he had just let go of the one thing he had allowed himself to care about. The police station was chaotic, buzzing with activity. Officers moved around, coordinating their next steps as the wealthy couple stood in the corner, waiting for any word about their missing child. Their faces were a mixture of exhaustion, worry, and hope. They had been frantic for hours, unable to process the horror of their daughter's disappearance. They had no idea where she was or if she was still alive. When the news finally came, it was almost too much to take in. A homeless boy had found their daughter, alive, well, and safe. It didn't make sense. How could someone who had nothing risk everything to save their child? Jaden stood by the door, looking out the window as the couple approached. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he could sense the confusion in their eyes as they walked toward him. "Is it really true?" the mother asked, her voice trembling. Jaden nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had never seen people like this before. The rich couple, dressed in expensive clothing, looked like they belonged in a different world. And yet here they were, thanking him for saving their daughter. The father, a tall man with sharp features, walked up to Jaden slowly. He seemed unsure of what to say, but he couldn't hide the gratitude in his eyes. "Why did you risk your life for someone you don't even know?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Jaden looked up at him, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea how to answer, but the words came from a place deep inside him. "Because I know how it feels to be alone," Jaden replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent. The mother's hand flew to her mouth, and the father's eyes filled with tears. They could see the pain in his eyes, the scars of a life lived in the shadows. They could see the truth behind his words. He had given up everything to help their daughter because he understood what it felt like to be forgotten, to be abandoned. The father stepped forward, his voice shaking as he spoke. "We want to thank you, Jaden. What you did, it's more than we could ever repay." And in that moment, Jaden knew his life was about to change. The couple, deeply moved by his words and actions, made an offer that would change Jaden's future forever. They would adopt him into their family, offer him a home, and ensure he would never be alone again. No more streets, no more hunger, no more fear. Jaden couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had no idea what a family like theirs could offer him, but the warmth in their eyes told him it was real. He could finally have a place to call home. The next few days were a blur of activity. Jaden was given a clean set of clothes, food, and a warm bed to sleep in. The house they took him to was beautiful, nothing like the dilapidated buildings he had known. The walls were painted, the floors polished. There was a soft bed with a pillow, something he had never experienced before. And in the corner of the room, there was a crib for his new baby sister, the child he had saved. As Jaden looked at the little girl, sleeping peacefully in her crib, something inside him stirred. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like an outsider. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a family, and he had a future. That night, as Jaden sat on the floor, looking at his new life, he smiled. He smiled for himself, for the little girl he had saved, and for the new beginning that awaited him. He wasn't just a boy from the streets anymore. He was part of something bigger, something filled with love and promise. He was finally home. Jaden stood at the edge of his new porch, looking up at the stars in the clear night sky. The quiet hum of the neighborhood around him felt surreal, almost like he was dreaming. His hands, once calloused and rough from years of survival, rested gently by his sides as he took in the view. He thought back to where he came from, The cold streets, the hunger, the loneliness. It had all felt like an endless struggle, like there was no way out. But everything changed that day, the day he chose to help, not knowing the life-altering consequences of his decision. He had saved a child. But in doing so, he had also saved himself. Sometimes, the family you save becomes the family that saves you. The voice echoed softly in his mind. Words he'd never expected to hear in his lifetime, let alone believe. A contented smile crossed his face as he let out a slow, steady breath. For the first time in so long, Jaden felt at peace. He was no longer invisible, no longer trapped by the past. His future stretched before him wide and full of promise. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living.